Perhaps we can now look at the so-called diplomacy that's been going on. Some actual diplomacy, some not so much. Actually, it's been a while since we spoke, Scott. So there is, of course, the Arab League summit where you had Bashar al-Assad come back after Syria was readmitted, a great moment, but you had Zelensky there quite strangely, and he was lecturing the Arab countries, telling them that they needed to oppose Russia and that Ukraine knows what it's like to be colonized and all of this really nonsense. But more recently, just in the last week or so, you had a delegation of African countries, I believe it was 7 top leaders, Zambia, South Africa, and many others, South Africa leading the mission for the African Union. And something very curious happened. And I want to play a tweet from um, detailing this, where you had the head of the security service for President Cyril Ramaphosa. It was held up in Poland, and then they could not enter Hungary's airspace. Hungary wouldn't allow them to enter, and so Ramaphosa was in Kiev without much of a security detail. But I want to play this video and get your reaction, Scott, because this has been something that's been going on for the entire conflict, where there have been legitimate attempts to foster an environment for peace. And you have Ukraine's so-called allies, and of course the United States and NATO countries all stymieing it. So I just want to play this video real quick of kind of the scene of what happened and get your reaction.
This aircraft, since we arrived here yesterday afternoon at about 1:30 in the afternoon, they are here. They have not been able to move to Kiev in order to go and protect President Ramaphosa. Wally Rueda, the head of the Presidential Protection Unit, practically yesterday saying that they are pretty much in the limbo. The Polish government is not cooperating with them, and they are effectively sabotaging President Cyril Ramaphosa's security detail. They did try to take out the weapons from the cargo of the plane yesterday evening for us in order to disembark from this plane, but they threatened to confiscate the weapons on the issue of permits. So at this point in time, Alden, over 22 hours we've been on this flight and not allowed to disembark. We are now being told, and our passports have been taken for processing. We may end up flying to Ritter-Russia and ultimately getting to Russia later on in the day in order to be able to make it to the meeting between the African heads of state and President Vladimir Putin tomorrow. If it's going to show you some of the conditions on this plane, we are effectively sleeping here. For instance, this was my bed for the past 48 hours since we left South Africa, and effectively yesterday since we arrived. I have been sleeping here. Other colleagues have been sleeping on these chairs of this aircraft. We only have 2 amenities, which are toilets that we are using amongst males and females on this aircraft.
So you get the picture. There was no such trouble on the trip to Russia. Russia was very amenable to the African delegation. But this has kind of been the contrast for quite some time. Your reaction, Scott, to this, because to me it was just so emblematic of what's been going on in this conflict since it began.
Well, let's just start with this incident in particular. I don't know all the details. I do know that there are some people who are sympathetic to the Polish government, saying that this airplane landed at the wrong airport, that didn't have the appropriate paperwork, and that they were non-cooperative. That could just be Polish, making up excuses. What we do know is that Poland is not a fan of these peace initiatives, and so. And we also do know the following, that the Polish are some of the most racist people in Europe. We know that because there were a number of African students studying in Ukraine when this conflict started, who tried to flee together with other Ukrainian refugees to Poland, and they were stopped at the border because they were black. The Poles are just straight up racist. So, I think that, more investigation has to be done, but you have to understand with the history of racism that people are allowed to assume that the actions that are taken towards the security detail were racist in terms of their intent and also disruptive to try and disrupt the peace process. And that's the reality. Look, there's only been one nation that has actively sought a negotiated settlement to this conflict, and that's Russia. Russia sought this through the Minsk Accords from 2014 up until the start of the conflict in February 2022. Russia kept saying, please implement Minsk. If you implement Minsk, all of this goes away. But we now know that the Ukrainians, the Germans, the French viewed Minsk as nothing more than a sham. It was designed to deceive the Russians, to buy time to build a Ukrainian army capable of carrying out offensive operations to resolve the situation in the Donbass. A lot of people don't know this, that in the lead up to the conflict, that Russia and Ukraine were engaged in active negotiations to prevent a war, that Russia was saying, look, we don't want to do this, but these are our conditions. You need to, say you're not going to join NATO. You need to get rid of some of this NATO infrastructure that you've developed. You need to do X, Y, and Z. But in exchange, the Donbass will be independent, but a referendum will be held to decide which way they want to go. Crimea will be Russian, but other than that, everything will be cool. The Ukrainians dumped that at the last minute, claiming how they fooled the Russians. But even when the Russians went in on the special military operation, the purpose of the special military operation wasn't to occupy Kiev or destroy Ukraine. It was to compel the Ukrainians to return to the negotiation that they walked away from. That's all Russia wanted. And we know this because there were 3 negotiations in Gomel, Belarus. There were additional consultations in Turkey that led to a scheduled meeting on 1 April between the Russian delegation, Ukrainian delegation, that would have resulted, had it occurred, with a peace treaty that would have brought an end to the conflict. How do we know this? Well, that African delegation met with Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg. And in there, where they were talking about the importance of negotiating, Putin said, just so you guys know, that's what we've been trying to do. And he produced the treaties signed by the Ukrainians, where they said, yep, we agreed to this in principle. Let's get the final delegations in to finalize this. The Ukrainians walked away based upon pressure put upon them by Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister. But the Russians have been seeking a negotiated conclusion to this conflict from day one. And here's, again, the irony is the peace treaty that Ukraine was offered on 1 April is pretty much what the Ukrainians are saying they want now. Russians out of Kherson, Russians out of Zaporizhia, and things of that nature. So, think of the 350,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. Think of the 20 million displaced Ukrainian civilians. Think of the $1 trillion in damage that's been done to Ukrainian infrastructure. And all that could have been avoided had the Ukrainians just negotiated in good faith. But they haven't. The only party that has negotiated in good faith is the Russians. And but I think the day of negotiations over. I think the Russians are no longer seeking to bring Ukraine to the table. They're seeking the strategic defeat of Ukraine now. And that's how this war has changed. And the difference between the Russian objective of seeking the strategic defeat of Ukraine and the Ukrainian objective of seeking the strategic defeat of Russia is only one side is actually able to achieve the desired outcome. And that's Russia able to decisively defeat Ukraine, which is happening as we speak. The Ukrainian army is being chewed up, spit out, and they don't have the ability to replace these troops with sufficient training or equipment to have a meaningful impact on the battlefield. This war is heading to its final concluding moments.
Could you talk about, as you were talking throughout the duration of this conversation, it's been coming up every so often. So Ukraine, we know that Ukraine, we've known since 2014, even before that, there's a lot of interference in the United States. Nothing really happens in Ukraine's government without the United States. A lot of training, a lot of influence held over the Ukraine's government. But even so, could you talk about what now that kind of the reality is really clear. It's hard to avoid. Not even the Western mainstream media can really avoid the destruction that's going on. And also even just these examples of how Ukraine just rejects any kind of peace process, and Russia and these African countries, BRICS countries, China, all these countries are trying their best to create an environment for peace. And Ukraine, more often than not, is the loudest opponent. And so, what's in it for these? You could call puppets, you could call it whatever they are. This political class that is at the helm of this conflict. Like, what's in it for them at the end of the day? Because it feels, I mean, this feels really perilous. We're talking about manpower problems, weapon systems problems. We're talking about possible nuclear confrontation down the road because of all of these limitations that are coming to the fore. So what's in it for them? It just seems absolutely, there's not even an inkling of maybe we need to slow down even. It just seems like this process of speeding up this war, speeding up the inevitable, it seems to be most enthusiastically pushed by the Ukraine side.
Well, for the Ukrainians, there's two facets to this problem. We'll start with the non-Nazis, the average Ukrainian. They have been told that Ukraine is going to become a member of NATO, and therefore that they will get these security guarantees against Russia by being a member of NATO. They've also been told that they will be invited into the European Union. And so what they're looking at is a prosperous Ukraine plugged into the rest of Europe, that Ukraine will finally be the European nation it always wanted to be, treated as an equal, get the respect. And for a lot of Ukrainians, they're like, yeah, that's what we want. You know, we if we choose the Russia path, which of course Viktor Yanukovych had chosen, he rejected the joining the EU. He said, no, we're going to stick with Russia. Many Ukrainians believe that, well, that just will make us the perpetual junior partner. And we don't want to be the junior partner. We want to be our own, the lead, Ukraine, a powerful nation, part of the European Union, where we believe we could dominate. So there's a lot of that going on. There's also the fact that this conflict provides the only pathway to power for the Banderists, for the Nazis. These people were a minority. They're a majority in Western Ukraine, but a minority throughout Ukraine. But they were able to use the unrest that was generated by the United States in promoting the events that led up to the 2014 Maidan movement in Kiev. They were able to use this so that they could leverage their willingness to commit acts of violence into real political power. Even though they can't get the votes at the polls, it doesn't matter, because all these Nazis had to do is go up to, for instance, President Zelensky and say, if you implement Minsk, we will hang your body right there on Stepan Bandera Avenue in Kiev. And they meant it. And that's the thing. Anybody in parliament who speaks out against them gets beat up or killed or worse, because that's what Nazis do. That's what thugs do. And the Banderas are thugs. So this war represents the vehicle in which the Nazi movement has become mainstream, because, I think anybody who studied history understands that when you have violence, when you have war, when you have the chaos, when you have the disruption, extremes tend to become the norm. And these Nazis have become the norm. They are taking over. They are in control of the military. They are in control of civil society. Look at the military. The people in the military now willingly wear the emblems of the Nazi Waffen SS. They sing songs to Stepan Bandera on their graduation. These aren't the Azov people. These aren't the nationalist units. This is the mainstream Ukrainian army. General Zaluzhny, their commander, has a portrait of Stepan Bandera in his office. Okay, so the Banderas have taken over the security system. They control the intelligence service. They control the Ministry of Interior. They control the military. And in doing so, they now control the government. And so the Nazis need this war, need the continuation of this war to create the conditions which they believe are necessary for the um, the birth of the perfect Ukrainian nation. That is a Ukrainian nation free of the taint of Russia. You see, they view the Russians as an ethnic inferiority. They call them orcs, Muscals, and they want to kill them. And when I say they want to kill them, I mean they want to kill them. We saw what they do. They put them in buildings and burn them. Vladimir Putin at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum played a video clip that showed what the Banderas do: hack babies to death, hack mothers to death, kill thousands of civilians, shuttle people into barns and set the barns on fire. Anybody who leaves the barn gets mowed down by a machine gun. This is what the Banderas do. They're the triggermen of Babi Yar, killing 30 to 40,000 Jews in Kiev. They were the people who carried out rampages throughout Eastern Europe. They were the thugs that the Nazis used to intimidate people and murder people. And these are the people who declared war against the Polish citizens. Volyn massacre, 110,000 people slaughtered by the Banderas from 1943 to 1944. The Banderas are the people that the CIA turned to at the conclusion of World War II, using German Nazi intelligence, which were running the Banderas as a stay-behind force to disrupt the Red Army, Soviet Army. The CIA took over that operation, and from 1945 until 1954, CIA ran a covert war inside Western Ukraine, inside Poland, inside Ukraine proper, that resulted in the deaths of around 48,000 Soviet security forces. 48,000. That's sort of like almost what the Americans lost in Vietnam. It killed 250,000 Russian civilians. That's 250,000, in case people have trouble understanding what I'm saying. And probably cost another 150 to 200,000 Banderas supporters. This was an extraordinarily bloody conflict that nobody knows about. The CIA backed it. Now, in 1954, when the Banderas were finally defeated, around 150, 200,000 of them fled Ukraine to go into diaspora. They live in Canada, they live in Great Britain, they live in Australia, they live in America. 60 miles from here, from Albany, New York, is a little sleepy village of Ellenville, New York. In Ellenville, they have a park called Heroes Park. And in Heroes Park, they have a statue to Stepan Bandera and other Nazi thugs, Nazi murderers, Ukrainian nationalists, all. And every summer, the American Ukrainian community gathers there, and they have children camps where they wear Nazi uniforms. They hold Stepan Bandera's photograph. They sing praises. They have torch parades. This is in America today. Right now, we have Nazi parades glorifying the triggerman of Adolf Hitler's Waffen-SS, who is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And this is the national hero of Ukraine as we speak. These Banderists are empowered by this conflict. So the longer this war goes on, the more powerful and influential they become. And this is part of a CIA strategy. I'm trying to tell people that Banderists have always worked for the CIA since the end of the conflict. Even when the Banderists were defeated and fled into diaspora, the diaspora was used by the CIA to reach out into Ukraine to keep the Banderist ideology in the shadows. Now, they had some help with a big assist from Nikita Khrushchev. You remember in 1954, they were defeated. About 150,000 of them were arrested and sent to the Gulag, 10, 15, 25-year sentences because they're bad people. But in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev decided that he was going to expose the crimes of Joseph Stalin. And he began the process of, condemning Stalin. In order to do that, he opened up the Gulag and let everybody out and said they're political prisoners, including 150,000 Banderists who returned to Ukraine and now reintegrated themselves into Ukraine. And from 1956 until 1990, the CIA paid them to get back into power, to insinuate themselves. It's an ongoing CIA operation. Now, in 1990, the CIA stopped paying them because the Cold War was over. The wall was going to come down. It had come down. They were there. But the CIA, it's not that the United States stopped paying them. The CIA just found different ways to pay. For instance, instead of the CIA paying them directly, they use the National Endowment for Democracy, or they use other non-governmental organizations to provide funding for these banderists. And we can see through Victoria Nuland's intercepted phone call in 2014 that she knew that the people she was picking were close to the right sector, to the banderists. She was deliberately trying to promote these Nazis into high government offices because that's been the American plan. We've been using the banderists all along. And so this conflict is desirable not only for the banderists, but for the United States, because it allows us to empower those whom we really want to govern. This is why Congress, again, this is something for people to reflect on. Let's take a good Jewish American boy named Jamie Raskin. Now, he is a representative from the state of Maryland. And my God, he is a pious Jewish man of faith, and I respect that. And he's somebody who felt strongly about the fact that U.S. taxpayer dollars in 2015 were being used to train something called the Azov Battalion. And so Jamie Raskin and others supported an amendment to the Defense Authorization Act that said no money, American taxpayer money, can be used to train the Azov. Why? Because they're Nazis. He said, we're not going to pay for training Nazis. Jamie Raskin. Last year in 2022, Jamie Raskin was one of several congressmen who denied there being Nazis in Ukraine when American representatives reminded him that there was an amendment to not fund them. He said, you're supporting Vladimir Putin by manufacturing the lie that there are Nazis in Ukraine. Then he turned around and invited 4 Azov Battalion thugs, murderers, Nazis into the People's House where they were celebrated, wined, dined. They were allowed to sell the patches with Nazi symbols, sell them in an auction in the United States Congress to raise money for what? For the Nazis. We have lost our moral compass. We have lost our way. We are supporting the sickest, crudest, most odious people on the planet. And we support them by continuing the slaughter, by continuing this war. We know they can't win, but we do it anyways because the goal is to kill Russians. And the people who like to kill Russians are the banderists.
Yeah, well, as you were talking, I was remembering the Ukrainian National Guard's tweet, which is still up. I'm not going to pull it up due to possible censorship issues later, but essentially it was the Ukrainian National Guard showing Azov fighters bathing their bullets in pig's blood to use against Chechen fighters, Chechen soldiers, those who practice Islam. I mean, this is how absolutely just unhinged and fascist these forces are, and the great enablers, as you said, are the United States and the NATO countries. And I was hearing you on Richard Medhurst, and maybe to just conclude on this diplomacy point, obviously the United States and NATO, they know what they're doing. These European countries, the United States, they know what they're doing. They know who they're supporting. They know and ostensibly people like Mr. Milley and Lloyd Austin and these folks, they know where this could go. As you were speaking earlier about the potential for nuclear war and everything going boom and bye. So, I mean, I've heard you say before that the United States is willing to take that risk. Do you feel like there are any forces that don't want to take this risk? When I think about just the U.S.-China relationship, obviously there's business, executives, corporate executives. They don't necessarily want to take the risk with war. But in terms of the foreign policy establishment, I mean, how are you seeing this diplomatically from that point of view, just given all of what you just laid out in terms of who the United States has been willing to get into bed with?
Well, one of the best way to solve a problem is to accurately define the problem first. And what we have right now are people in Washington, D.C. Saying that the solution to the problem is continuing to double down on stupid, in effect, to continue this investment into the slaughter of Ukrainian men and the destruction of Western technology, etc. because they say the threat is so real, so visceral that we have no choice but to do this. Now, normally, this kind of policy would be challenged by the people's representatives, the United States Congress, where you would bring people in and have hearings and discuss this issue and say, well, you've said this, but let me ask you some questions. Let me demand some answers. Let's get some accountability here. Let's check, do some fact checking. Congress isn't doing that. There are things happening right now. I mean, to give you an example, the Pentagon just accounting error, $6.5 billion. What the hell? That's $6.5 billion more that we can use to, we're double tapping corruption so that our defense industry makes even more money off the American taxpayer. How stupid can we be? Apparently very stupid. Nobody's asking General Miley the question of if you knew that this, I mean, again, here's just be some of my questions that I would ask General Miley. General, how long does it take to train a U.S. Marine? And he'd say, well, 13 weeks of basic training. Okay, is that Marine after basic training ready to go into combat? No, sir. He now has to go into advanced individual training where he becomes an expert in his military occupation specialty. Wow, thanks, General. And how long does that take? That will take another, depending on the specialty, that could take anywhere from another, 10 weeks to several months of intensive training. Is the Marine ready to go to combat now, General? No. The Marine must now join his unit and begin an intensive program of integrating into the unit, training for the specific tasks given in the mission focus of the unit. How long does that take, General? That could take anywhere from 6 months to a year. So, General, you're telling me that in order to have a Marine ready for combat, he has to be trained for about, a year and a half. That's right. Okay. Oh, gosh. Now let's talk about the Ukrainians. How much training did the Ukrainians have that you brought to Grafenvor? Well, the average Ukrainian had about 7 weeks of training, maybe 5 weeks tops. And now you put them in contact with advanced NATO equipment. How long does it take to train them on that? To train somebody to operate the Leopard tank? Well, normally the training would take about 5 months. How long did you give the Ukrainians? Oh, we gave them about 5 weeks. And now you've introduced them to combined arms warfare. Very complicated thing. Yes. Our units take anywhere from 6 months to a year to learn how to do combined arms operations. And how long did you give the Ukrainians? We trained them in 4 weeks. So you took Ukrainians with no training. They don't know how to use equipment, and you exposed them to something doctrinally that they couldn't have learned. And then you allowed them to go to war. You murdered them. You see, had American troops been sent into combat with the level of preparation that Ukrainian troops were, Congress would be screaming. If 13,000 body bags came home in less than 3 weeks from any conflict, Congress would be saying, what the hell is going on? And if General Miley went before Congress and claimed to send American troops together with that kind of training they gave the Ukrainians, he'd be criminally negligent. He'd be liable to prosecution because it's murder what he's done. But because they're just Ukrainians, it's okay. We can murder them because we don't care about them. This is the awful reality of the situation that we see today. Americans claim to care about Ukraine. Hell, they virtue signal all over the place with those flags. But we don't care about them because if we did, we would never allow this to happen. This isn't how friends treat friends. We don't care about the Ukrainians, and that's the awful reality here. We're not doing this for Ukraine. We're doing this against Russia. We're willing to sacrifice an entire nation for the cheap thrill of hurting a nation that doesn't wish us any harm whatsoever. Russia is not seeking to bring harm to America. Any harm that's come to us is because of our own actions, what we have done economically by sanctioning Russia. The blowback has hurt us by going to war in Ukraine. The harm is the destruction of our equipment. But had we not gone to war, our equipment wouldn't be destroyed. Ukrainians wouldn't be dying. This is, what we're seeing here is we're exposing the lack of a moral compass on the part of the American people and our government representatives. We are a nation that has lost touch with that which used to define us. We used to be a good people. We used to be a people who believed in individual freedoms. We believed in the value of a human life. Not anymore. Not anymore. And some people say, Scott, you're naive. We never believed in that. And yeah, you could make the case. Korea, we certainly didn't like the Koreans, the South Koreans. We killed a lot of them. Vietnam, well, yeah, we killed a lot of South Vietnamese as well. We're not very good at that. Afghanistan, threw the whole country under the bus. Syria, yeah, we don't care. I guess I have to modify my statement. We don't care about anybody because we're incapable of being friends with anybody. America is only friends with itself, and even then we're not. Because look at the amount of homeless we have. Look how we treat our ethnic minorities. Look how we treat African Americans. Look how we treat anybody, people who don't have money, because that's all we care about is money. Show me the money. If the money's there, you're my friend until the money runs out, and then we dump you. That's the horrific reality of America today. And this is a sick nation. This is a diseased nation. We have to heal ourselves. And the best way to do that is to stop committing crimes overseas in the name of the American people and bring the resources home and learn to refocus ourselves on who we could be. You know, the Russians have a higher regard for the American people than the American people have for themselves. And that speaks volumes.